Want to point out that we do this every Wednesday morning between 8:30 and 9 o'clock with Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls, Idaho. It's called Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. And we're joined by one of the medical professionals in studio. And of course, we have a topic every week. And the medical professionals are also available to answer any questions or take comments that you may have on various health issues. Joining us this morning is Jeremy Daly. He's a physician assistant. First of all, welcome back.
Thank you.
You didn't know you were up in the rotation today.
Uh, I knew I was up. I think you didn't know I was up.
I'm often on the short end of things, but that's nothing to do with your office. That's just overall. I mean, in life. First of all, we're talking a little bit about vacations today. It's 8:34 and 70. Bill Colley with you as well this morning, answering the telephones right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And you were telling me off air that people often go out on an outing or hiking or a vacation, and you get all excited. You pack your clothes. You make sure you have your swimming trunks, but you don't necessarily make any plans for what happens if you have an accident or an illness.
Right. I think most of us we kind of overlook that detail, and sometimes we look at it as a minor detail, but if we get into a situation where we get hurt or injured, we really are totally put out. We have to stop what we're doing. We have to change our plans. We have to head in the other direction, and so planning ahead a little bit can save you a lot of grief and time when something does happen, and inevitably things do happen. We'd like to think that when we go on vacation or when we go camping or hiking that everything will go smoothly, no one will be injured. But the fact of the matter is it happens, and more often than we'd want to think. So, being the season of outdoor living in Idaho, there's definitely a season of indoor living, it seems. But during the outdoor living season, those are just some things that I wanted to talk about today, as far as what things we can do to prepare for those situations, and how we can prevent ourselves from having to make too many trips to the urgent cares, and well, sometimes it does happen, but sometimes we can prepare for things and kind of mitigate some of those problems.
Right away, we think about the Independence Day weekend coming up, and of course, a lot of people will be doing backyard barbecues, and so we're not talking about necessarily major burns, but a lot of people end up grilling, and they end up with some minor burns. Uh, Maybe an aloe plant or something around to assist with that. You've got to think about these things, a little bit in advance. They would help you out, and on the other end, if you're out and about traveling, hiking in the mountains, I would assume there's a whole different slate of things you need to be concerned about.
Yeah, I think definitely you should have the things that you need in your home. When you think about days like Independence Day, there's a lot of people that aren't working, like us. That's one day that we're closed during the year, and so we wouldn't be available to help on that day. So making sure that you have things in your home, and if someone gets cut or someone gets burned or someone gets a sliver, that you have the equipment that you need at your own house to take care of those injuries. And sometimes you need to go to the urgent care. That's true, or the emergency room. But but a lot of times it can be prevented, or you can take care of a situation sooner if you have the things that you need. So, one thing that I really wanted to talk about is when you go on a trip. You kind of mentioned this earlier off the air when we were talking about some trips that you made to Canada, and how you hadn't really thought about, is your medical insurance going to be active in that area? Are you going to be able to get care if you need it? What happens if you get in a car accident? Do you do you have insurance that covers you in that area? And so I think those are things that we should think about when we travel. I actually worked for the county of El Paso in some clinics down there, and if we traveled out of El Paso and we sought medical care, they would cover us, but our out of pocket was just astronomical. It was a self-insured uh, county, and so our premiums were low and our care was great as long as we were in network. But as soon as we went out of town, then we were in a position where, we would have to pay a lot of money if someone was injured. And so we definitely considered that when we made our trips, and knew where we could get coverage, coming up here to Idaho and visiting family. And that's what I, encourage people to do, is look around to where you're going, see what kind of urgent cares are available, and see what kind of hospitals are available for care, especially if you have a chronic disease or issues that could precipitate a bigger problem. It's important to know those things in advance and not put yourself in a position where you could be, in a life-threatening situation.
We have a break coming up, but before we do that, what's the telephone number at Trip Family Medicine?
It is 933-4400.
And you're on Facebook.
We are on Facebook. Shalene is really good about updating that on a regular
Yes,
basis,
she is.
and we have some really fun videos. Couple of things on there that I think are really great. A lot of a lot of you may have seen the ball that we had at the parade, the 12-foot red bouncy ball. I don't know how you could have missed that if you were there. So some fun pictures of that, and we also recently uh, had some shades put up at the community pool that have our logos on them, and there's some really cool pictures on the Facebook page of those. So I'd encourage everyone to take a look at those and see what we've been doing in the community.
We've got more coming up with Jeremy Daly in just a couple of minutes. He is a physician assistant from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls, Idaho. We're talking this morning better health on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Get this, up to 72 already, 20 minutes away from 9 o'clock. Our studio guest, Jeremy Daly, is joining us from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls. We do this every Wednesday morning between 8:30 and 9 o'clock with a member of the staff. It's called Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. And you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley answering the telephones. If you have a question or comment for the physician assistant while he's in studio with us, feel free to give us a telephone call. That number is 736-0300. We're at 74, and we're about 16 minutes away from 10 o'clock this morning. Jeremy, you were talking about little preparations, but even small things. Now, when you think about this, I mentioned to you off air that I'd gone up to the mountains last weekend, but I didn't think about taking along a first aid kit, which you might think about having in your automobile anyway,
Right.
in the trunk or somewhere at all times. But if you're flying somewhere, is it easy to do that? I mean, should you take something along too?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can bring on the plane that would be permissible to bring, but I mean, for the most part, if it's checked bag, then there's usually no issues with anything in a first aid kit. And most of the time, when you're on the plane itself or in the airport, there's medical personnel that are available to assist. So that's usually not as big of a deal. However, this was in the news this week, and I kind of thought about it. There was a man on a plane having a heart attack, and it was kind of a big deal. It was Tim Tebow, and he was in the plane and praying over this guy. And anyway, I thought about from a medical standpoint, that is a tough situation, and I'm sure that the flight attendants are trained to some extent, but if you have a history of heart attacks, if you have a history of things that can be very serious, just making sure that you have something like an aspirin, which is something we treat people with anyway in the emergency room, when they're having a heart attack, just to help with clotting and basically to not form more clots and make a heart attack worse. And so something like that even would be important to have in your first aid kit when you're flying, just medicines that you typically don't take, but you could need in an emergency situation.
From what I read, and people were almost in a panic because this man was having this heart attack. And it wasn't just his family, but it was the section of the plane. And Tebow came along and prayed with the family and with the other people in that section and calmed everyone down, allowing the medical people to actually do the work they needed to do. That's another thing. Not all of us are going to run into him on an airplane, but that's another thing we've got to keep in mind is an ability, no matter where you are, because if you're in a strange place, sometimes trying to stay calm is, that's a huge part of what we're talking about too, I think. If you keep a cool head and you have a family member who's having a problem, keeping a cool head could save their lives.
Yeah, and it really could. And I think a lot of times the thing that helps us to feel okay about situations is a little bit of preparedness. I think everyone should have first aid training and CPR training. I think that should be something that everyone tries to obtain, because you never know when something's going to happen. And just small things like learning how to do CPR can save people's lives. And so I think when you go on a plane, or when you travel somewhere, you should be prepared as best you can. Obviously, not everyone is a trained medical professional, and that's okay. But there are small things that people can do like bringing certain medications and certain supplies when they're traveling in their car. Just have a kit that's always there. And I did want to talk about actually some specifics
Hmm.
of things that people should bring in their first aid kits that they typically don't. So I have a question for you, Bill. What would you think would be maybe some good things to bring in a first aid kit?
Bandages, number one.
That's good.
I might bring something along the lines of peroxide or an alcohol for sterilization.
Sure.
Tweezers, because sometimes you got to remove a splinter or something along those lines, and maybe something along the lines even as simple as an epinephrine, because there can be people who obviously have an allergic reaction to a sting or a bug bite.
Yeah, I think those are all great things and probably things that are not thought of very very often in a first aid kit. Typically, we think of bandages. I think that's usually the number one thing that we look for.
Hmm.
Maybe a gauze wrap, something like that. Uh, Something like an alcohol wipe to sterilize, and then we usually think about just an antibiotic ointment, and that's most first aid kits. That's about what they have in them,
Right.
and so when it comes to other things that happen, well, what if we're worried about a fever? Do we have a thermometer in our first aid kit? How are you going to know if someone has a fever or, if a child has a fever? And most of the time, we don't bring a thermometer in the first aid kit. So that's something I'd encourage people to have. The tweezers are great. A lot of people don't think about tweezers, but of probably the two most common situations camping, hiking, being out in the woods are getting cut, getting cuts and scrapes and getting slivers. And so just having tweezers is actually a great idea and something that people don't think about. Another thing, shears. So
Hmm.
scissors to cut off clothing if need be. If someone has a bone that's broken, the last thing that you want to do is take that article of clothing off through the joint that's hurt. So just having something like that there that you can cut away the clothing with. Um, Having a heat and cold pack, those are so nice to have. We have these little cold packs that you can break and mix together, and the heat packs, same thing. Just having something like that makes a big difference when someone sprains an ankle or they're having soreness in their muscles, and can actually keep a trip from having to end and keep things going. Um, some One thing that I had never thought about having in a first aid kit, and I actually worked with a ER physician who said, "Well, you always have to make sure you have super glue in your first aid kit." And a lot of people don't think about that, but it's something we use a very similar, uh, basically glue in emergency settings to bring cuts together, and so that's something that a lot of people overlook in their first aid kits as well.
When I was in high school, I can remember the first aid kit our coaches would have right on the football field. And, if a guy would get a bad bruise or have an issue, or they thought he might have a broken bone, but they always had these packs. And what they could do is they could just split something and there would be a chemical reaction, and then they would suddenly have a cold pack
Right.
and they could apply that. So most people don't carry those things, but if you fall down a gully, and it might not be a bad thing to have that to wrap around your ankle to keep the swelling down, right, in a situation like that.
Right, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. They make some really small cold packs and heat packs basically that you can fit into a first aid kit. Obviously, depending on where you're going and what you're doing, you're going to want to modify the size of the kit. You're not going to want to take a 20-pound kit
Hmm.
for a day hike, but you can bring plenty of things that don't weigh very much. Another thing that I wanted to mention was medication. I mean, how many times do we bring medication in a first aid kit? Things like an antihistamine, something like Benadryl for an allergic reaction, or glucose, the basic sugar that you can put in someone's cheek if they're low on their blood sugar, something like an antidiarrheal. If you're on a long hiking trip and you're back in the woods, I mean, there's a chance that you could get sick. It does happen. You're going to get rashes. So having something like a topical steroid cream, like cortisone over the counter, or there's antifungal creams that you can bring with you as well, because those things do happen too. Um, and then making sure you have pain medication, Tylenol or ibuprofen, and aspirin, like we mentioned earlier, is a great tool to have in your kit if someone's in an emergency situation where they're having a heart attack. it can save someone's life as well.
The other day we had a story where we saw that there was a daring nighttime flight, mercy flight to Antarctica because of somebody being sick there. And I've heard stories about people down there on research before who've had to have emergency medical care. And you pointed out earlier, you've got to know where the hospitals are. But sometimes, let's say you were, I don't know, hiking up somewhere in the area around Stanley or whatever, and there aren't a lot of hospitals near there. So you should probably let people know where you're going, right? And have a timetable where just in case you don't come back, they can sort of pinpoint your location.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Sometimes we do things kind of on a last minute basis. You had mentioned earlier about your trip last week where you just went up into the mountains and did some hiking. And I would be surprised if someone knew where you were at.
Right. No one would have known.
So we're glad you made it back. But those are things that are really important to think about. Do friends and neighbors know where you're at, and would they come looking if you were gone?
Well, on just the simple cell phone, I mean, I guess you can get some GPS tracking too, right? So if you had a phone that had that ability, and all of a sudden someone said, he's 3 hours overdue, is it possible? I mean, can we do something like that too, so you can be better tracked?
I don't know. I'm sure they you can be tracked. I don't know if they ping at the last coordinate that your phone goes out of service, but that's something definitely it's important to have with you a phone. I think most of us that's kind of a foregone conclusion nowadays, but you know,
A friend of mine is leaving today. In fact, he sent me a message this morning, and he's going up into a part of the hills in Pennsylvania for a week. And he said, "There's no cellular service.
hmm,
There's no television. They love this. They do this trip every year. They spend a week up there in this isolated encampment, but they have rattlesnakes and some other issues up there too. So, knowing that, would you take along maybe? Can an average person get anti venom in a kit?
no, it's even something that some hospitals don't have around. So it's expensive for one, and it expires, and so it's difficult to keep those things around. But just knowing that that's the situation, you'd probably want to wear extra thick socks and long pants and things to prevent if there were a bite, it prevent that from actually getting into the skin and poisoning the person. So I think those things would probably be a better plan than having an anti venom on hand, but just planning ahead.
And you might do some reading up on what would happen if you got bitten, so you would know what course to take if you're out there in the middle of nowhere.
Sure, I think that's a great idea too. Just looking at some of the contingencies, and I think that's tough to do. You can't plan for everything necessarily, but at the very least, just having a really good first aid kit, and making sure that you can help the people around you and help yourself if need be.
I had a neighbor. He went away for a hike on what is it? I guess Columbus Day weekend in 1992, and we never saw him again. And his car was found at a particular lot where he parked near one of the mountains, and just completely vanished. And 24 years later, still no sign of him. So these are the worries people have, and that's why I guess it's important to have that plan in place. It's just simply for your family, so they can get some closure if it gets to that point.
Yeah, I think that's a awful situation, and obviously we don't plan on those things happening. But I think just letting people know where you're at, simply saying this is where I'm going and this is what I'm doing, and that could
No,
keep you from being in that kind of a situation.
no, if you're a diabetic or you've got a heart issue and you have to take, you mentioned prescriptions earlier. You should also, I would assume, especially the diabetics, you need to have something in that kit available as well, right?
No, definitely. If especially if you're struggling to control your diabetes, but making sure that there's like the glucose we talked about. If you get too low, which happens quite a bit with diabetics, depending on the medication that they take, but if they're on insulin, that's something that we worry about quite a bit. But making sure that they have something to control their blood sugar if it gets too high. That's just it can be just as scary of an issue if you get too high and people go into what's called diabetic ketoacidosis, and it can be life threatening. So
We got about 40 seconds to go. Just a quick note. Again, if people would like to contact the office, you have often, you're looking for new patients and you often have same day appointments. What's the number again?
yeah, it's 933-4400, and we we'd love to see people for same day appointments. If they get cut and they need stitches or minor fracture care, they break their finger or they think they might have broken their arm and it's not anything that looks like it's sticking out. That would be an emergency room visit if it's sticking out, by the way. But if it's not and they're concerned, we take care of those things, and we are happy to see those patients, and we like to make sure that we can get them in on the same day.
We want to thank you for coming by today. And Jeremy, in the rotation, we'll probably see you sometime in July,
I look forward to it.
maybe twice. So,
Yeah, I
because
think I think that may be the case.
somebody may be absent for a few days.
That's true.
It's Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. One more hour of top story with Bill Colley is on the way. But first, Fox News is just ahead.